Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening for this special event, which is a launch of this book. It is an actual book that you can hold in your hands called Intraconnected. My name is Ellie Weisbaum, and I'm an assistant professor and the teaching stream for the Buddhism, Psychology, and Mental Health program at New College at the University of Toronto. I'm really happy to be supporting this event tonight as your moderator for the evening. I'll be gently guiding us through. We have lots to do, lots of folks to connect to. The plan for the evening is to start in a moment by hearing the University of Toronto land acknowledgement, and then I'll share with you a little bit more about what we have planned to do together tonight. So before I continue, I want to invite one of my wonderful students who's currently in my fourth year class, Research Methods on Mindfulness and Meditation, to read us the University of Toronto land acknowledgement. And in addition to this, we just want to acknowledge that a paragraph is limited by time and space. And so we know that this paragraph is maybe intraconnected to many things beyond it. So I just really want to invite us to hear this paragraph as an invitation. That it is limited by time and space. It's in our Newtonian realm of large objects with edges. And so in that way, it's also an invitation for us to touch maybe the quantum, the ultimate dimension, if we're talking in Buddhist psychology terms, but just to take that moment in this historic dimension to hear a paragraph that really is directing us to so much more. So with that, I'd like to invite Angeline to read us the land acknowledgement from U of T.
Thank you so much. So now I'd like to invite everyone to just take a moment, eyes open or closed, to arrive in the present for this acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you for sharing. And I want to add a few more words that were shared with me from the Equity, Activism, and Education course that was taught in our program this past spring. They brought in a few more words that come from the Toronto Museum of Contemporary Arts Land Acknowledgement 2022. And in this, it just shares that they shared that as a class and individuals, we want to work to dismantle the legacy of colonial systems that impact all aspects of our practices to the best of our ability. Through our participation in this work and in holding ourselves accountable, we carry forward a commitment to listen, unlearn, and to grow. And so just to also bring in those words and that invitation for each of us, which I feel is very congruent with what we're going to explore tonight. So with that, I don't want to take up too much more time. I want to hand over the floor to our guest book launcher this evening. What I will say, our plan is for Dan to take us on a little wanderoo of his inspiration, motivation behind this book, and then we'll have a chance to have a bit of community dialogue to hear from some questions from the wonderful peers and colleagues that are in the webinar room and from all of you. The Q&A function is there, so as he's sharing, if something bubbles up in you that you want to ask, please feel free to drop it in, and we'll be taking a look at that. A brief introduction of Dan, who has many accolades. And if you buy the book, you can read the whole bio, but I just want to highlight, he received his medical degree from Harvard University. He's a clinical professor of psychiatry at the UCLA School of Medicine, a founding co-director of the Mindful Awareness Research Center at UCLA, executive director of the Mindsight Institute, which is an educational organization that offers online learning, in-person seminars, all of which look at the development of mindsight in individuals, families, and communities, and how this can enhance and examine the interface of human relationships and basic biological processes. What I want to say before I hand it over is just that Dan is a wonderful human. I've had the pleasure of having him as a mentor, a colleague, and friend for many years. And one of my favorite things to tell my students or friends when they read his books is, the human that you feel coming through those words is the human that wrote them. And we have shared hikes We've hugged trees in forests together. And so without further ado, I want to warmly welcome Dr. Dan Siegel to take over the webinar, take us into your mind and journey, and I look forward to having more dialogue with you on the other side.
Thank you, Dr. Weisbaum. Thank you all for being here. It is truly an honor that I'm deeply grateful for, to be with old friends, to meet new friends, and to join with all of you here, all of us, to invite us to look at a conversation that we might consider having. This conversation is an ancient one in many ways, that indigenous peoples from all over the world have been having, and in many ways invite us to look to their wisdom. So here in Southern California, I'm on the unceded lands that were traditionally the stewards of the Chumash and the Tongva, and the teachings in their cultures were all about our deep connection with nature and with all human beings. So we'll look at, what has happened in what we can call modern culture that has taken us away from the indigenous teachings that come from all over the world. We'll also be looking at some deep contemplative insights from meditative practices from a number of different traditions that also independently have come to very similar conclusions from thousands of years of reflective practice. And while some of those are coming now back into the conversation of modern culture, or coming into the conversation of modern culture, we need to look at how these ancient wisdom practices from contemplation and from indigenous knowledge keepers can actually help us see where we as a human family need to go forward. Now, there's a body here, a body called Dan, that is speaking to you in your body. And I need to begin acknowledging, coming from an institute where I work called the Mindsight Institute, that this body has certain features which in the United States of America, the nation that I live in, give it a position of privilege. So the skin color that this body has, some people would call white. And in a white dominant society that came from Europeans who came and entered Turtle Island, entered what we now call North America, and had the largest genocide in the history of humanity, of killing the people who were here, this skin color became the dominant color, not on the planet, but in this country. And this white dominance has given the privilege of this body, even though my ancestors were themselves marginalized and murdered in other countries in Europe where they were. Here in this country, those things didn't happen. This body is also a cisgender male, meaning I was named a male when I was born. I have the genetics of a male and I have the identity of a male. So that's all goes together. That's the cis part. And so that's also part of the dominant way we are in this culture. The majority of people are cisgendered. And this body is also happens to be heterosexual, also a dominant and privileged position in the United States of America. And I'm in a socioeconomic position now, not my parents, but of having been educated and being in a status which you would say is a status of privilege. So I say all that because this body speaking, we need to acknowledge that we all have something called implicit biases. So there may be things that I say that I'm blind to because I will have in this privileged position blind spots, even for my blind spots. And if anything comes up that makes you feel misunderstood or discounted in any way, please reach out to us at the Institute at the email admin for administration, admin at mindsightinstitute.com, MINDSIGHT institute.com. And just let us know, because we want to keep the channels of communication open and let everything be an opportunity to deepen our connections with one another and also deepen our learning. And this positionality also, this place of privilege, really means that anything I say needs to be understood that, you know, I'm trained as a scientist, I'm trained as a physician, I'm trained as a psychotherapist, and I'm also an educator. Those are all my professional different backgrounds that are relevant. And so that also gives me a certain lens that as I speak, we need to recognize it has a certain bias to it. And so when we get into our discussion period and in a conversation with Ellie Weisbaum, we can open to the other things that might be important to point out. And I'll do the best I can. So those are just some preliminary comments as we dive into the topic of today, which is the idea of what is the self, what is identity, and what is belonging. So self-identity and belonging are interrelated experiences that we have. And we'll begin with the first one, self. And I want you just to reflect on this for a few moments to begin with, and then we're going to be coming back again and again to this. But what does that word self mean? So just let's sit with that. If you're taking notes, or you know, if you're watching a recording of this later on, you can obviously press pause and just do some internal notes, or actually write notes down. What does that word mean for you? So this question of what is the self is a very, I think, important place for us to start. And when I've asked, you know, large groups about this, many people will say, well, the self is the individual. And we know that because we have words like self-understanding, means the individual has insight into their own inner workings. We have words like self-regulation, meaning I'm regulating my own internal processes, or even the behavior that emanates from my body. We have a term like self-compassion, meaning how do I have this way of sensing my own suffering and do things to be kind to myself, using that word. And all of those ways we use it would have you suggest that the implication of all those terms is that the word individual is really a synonym, a word that means the same thing as the word self. And if that were the case, then what we would do is basically what the field of mental health has done in the West in modern times, say, well, yeah, the mental health of the self is what's so important. So self-actualization, self-discovery, self-realization, all these things about the individual are what's important. And as you may know, at least in the last 30 or 40 years or so, we haven't gotten much improvement when the focus of mental health is only on the individual. So what went wrong in the field of mental health that that's the case? And what does it really mean even to say mental health when the field of mental health, the fields in it, like my field, psychiatry, or I'm trained in psychological research, when we don't even define what the mind is? So this becomes a very interesting, an interesting exercise in language. And you may say, well, Dan, why in the world are you spending time on a word? Who really cares? Well, here's the thing about words. If you picture like an iceberg, the tip of that iceberg is a word. It's a symbol, a linguistic symbol that you and I can share with each other. But beneath that are concepts that the word is sitting on top of. So when we speak a word like self to each other, we have a shared concept, which basically structures what we believe is the nature of reality. And then beneath those, we have categories, the way we divide up the world so that we understand what it's made of. So categories and concepts and symbols are really why we're concerned about the words we use, because it's the tip of that whole chain of mental processing you would call, you know, cognition or information processing. Now, the reason to take a few moments now and say, well, what do words and language really mean, these linguistic symbols? Well, here's the deal. We perceive what we believe. So there's no such thing as immaculate perception. So if you're a child raised in a family that believes the self is the same as the individual, and Ellie is raised as Ellie, I'm raised as Danny, and my parents say to me, Danny, this is who you are, Danny this, Danny that. And then I get to school, and then my teachers say, there's Danny, and there's Billy, and there's Ellie, and there's Sammy, and there's Janet. We all have these separate selves. And then I get to work and I have to write my name out and I get a number associated to pay taxes. And pretty soon everything reinforces the idea that who I am, just to use that phrase, my identity is an entity. So an entity is a noun-like thing. You can hold it with your hand, like a rock or a ball. Here's one entity, here's another entity, and they're separate from each other and you can hold them. So those entities are noun-like things. And in language terms, in modern cultural languages like English, we have a lot of nouns. The majority of our words are nouns. But in indigenous languages, for example, the Potawatomi in North America, what we call North America now, are mostly verbs, as is true in many other cultures, like the Taino in South America or the Aboriginal in Australia, the place we call Australia. So when you have a language that's full of nouns, what you're doing is you're sharing a languaging process where you're nounifying things as an entity, and then we think the self is a thing, a noun-like thing. Now, you could say, well, all right, so then once I'm believing that the self is the same as an individual that's an entity, what's the consequence of that? Well, the consequence is that you perceive what you believe. So that means that through this filter, what's called a top-down filter of what you've been told by your parents and your teachers and your peers and your coworkers and your employers, and everyone is acting as if you're an entity, then your experience is that, in fact, you are an entity, that there is a Dan in this body, there's an Ellie in that body, and that you are now with some feeling of familiarity. I mean, if people are talking about it, it must be true, right? And if I'm perceiving it that way, well, it must be true. So what we're beginning to get a sense of is that if your center of identity, which we're going to say is yourself, identity meaning what are the features of self-experience that have you say who you are? That's what identity is, in one way of thinking of identity. When you look at the science of identity, scientists talk about a lot of different ways of looking at the self. You can look at it, as I do in the book, Intraconnected, across development. You can look at it in present time. You can look at it from a contemplative point of view. What we're going to do is extract from all those different sciences a way of saying that there are at least three things that are in common. And when you find things in common, E.O. Wilson, the neurobiologist, the sociobiologist, calls that consilience. And we're going to use that process of finding the common ground across independent pursuits and say that in the cross-science view of self, three things are described. And they, fortunately, if some of you know my addiction problem, is I have an acronym addiction. So the acronym here is SPA, the SPA of selfhood that's in all the different sciences, the sensation or subjective experience, the perspective, and the agency. Subjective experience is, what does it feel like to be you, in quotes, you? What does it feel like to be a bat? What does it feel like to be an amoeba? What does it feel like to be the named entity that you would name yourself as a noun-like thing? I'm Dan. So that's the sensation. The perspective is looking through your glasses, if you will. What's it like to see from the point of view, the frame of reference? This perspective also defines what the self is. It's a center of experience, if you will, that's really about energy and information flow. And this center of experience then can have a center in the body. So a sensation in the body, a perspective in the body, and an agency where what do you act on behalf of? So if you stub your toe, do you help your toe feel better? You know, if you're doing a lot of teaching and talking and sessions and everything, do you actually walk through those experiences? So right now you may have noticed I'm actually walking. So I have agency, you know, I'm on a walking desk, you know, so I have agency to move this body left, right, left, right. Now, in that three elements of self experience across the sciences, you get a very interesting question that comes up then, which is, how is your belonging shaped by your experience of self and what you identify as your self experience of subjective experience, perspective, and agency? So belonging can be defined as a sense of being part of something. So you can actually belong or not to your body. So sometimes people who've been traumatized actually don't have an experience of belonging to their body. You can have an experience where someone's in a marriage, but they don't feel like they belong in the marriage, or a child is in a classroom, they don't feel like they belong. So just being physically a part of a group doesn't mean you have the experience of belonging. So belonging is a way, in a sense, that you can feel a part of something without losing the integrity of the individual aspects of something. That's one broad way of talking about belonging. And you can see where how you use what we're going to name as an identity lens, which we're going to exercise right now, can shift your sense of belonging. And you can make that identity lens very close up. So imagine a camera where you're able to really focus in on the details of something. Let's start right now. Just a simple exercise. If you're able to move your arm and put your hand in front of your eyes, why don't you try this and just look at your thumb, right? Just look at that thumb, right? And you can even move the thumb around, and you can see that that thumb, you know, if you're able to, if you don't have some neurological problem where you can't move your thumb, but if you can move your thumb, move that thumb around, and then try expanding from the thumb to move all your fingers around, and just notice your hand movements. Right now, you are having the sensation of the hand moving. You can almost imagine just being the fingers and what life is like from being those fingers. And you're also having an agency of those fingers. Now, of course, you have your palm, you can move your palm around and then even bend your wrist around. And pretty soon you can bend your whole arm around and even maybe get your whole body into it. And then as you do this, you know, you are now experiencing, well, I, in quotes, am in a body. And that is true. In fact, if you're hearing me, you're very likely in a body. So the first close-up identity lens thing we can say is there's a skin encased body that gives us, in terms of our languaging, a way of talking about the spatial aspect of self-experience. So we're going to use the word inner, meaning what's related to the skin encased body. So we're going to say that, sure, you have the reality of the internal aspect of what goes on in the body. Now, you might say, well, hold on, isn't that what the individual is? And you could say, yeah, I guess, you know, even though the mind isn't exactly like the brain, there's an interiority that things refer back to the history of the body, the agency of the body, the perspective of the body, the sensation of the body. And yes, so you have an inner self. You might even name that inner self like me, right? And that's fine. And you have an inner self. But now let's continue that exercise, which we began with the thumb, and now you're in your body. And just wherever you are in your immediate space around you, maybe there are other people, maybe there, in my case, I have a wonderful young animal. Let me see what she's doing. She's sleeping here. And just extend it to the space that you can see with your eyes right now. And you can look around if you want, but you don't need to look around. That space exists whether you see it or not. And just let yourself realize that, wow, I have a body, that's fine. And now I'm widening my identity lens which means I'm letting sensation, perspective, and agency now broaden beyond certainly the brain and becoming bigger than the body. And just see if you can feel into the room that you're in, or if you're listening to this in a forest, the forest you're in. And just feel that. Let's start with the S. See if you can just let the subjective sensation of the space around you just fill awareness. And now let's see if you can let the perspective of that space, how that space might perceive in whatever modalities it might perceive, the feeling, the kinetic feeling of something, the visual thing of light, how sound fills that space. Just let the perspective of the space fill awareness. And now as you let that sense of sensation, perspective, and now we're going to agency, let agency fill the self-experience of the whole space. What would you do now with that space? Like, this is the place I've written, every book I've ever written is in this literal little room, which my wife thinks is wild that I like being in this little room, but I like little rooms. So, you know, this little room has a lot of history to it. And it, you know, for the last 30 years, it's been like some little cave of existence, and it's a complete mess, according to my wonderful wife. And I love it, a mess. If I showed you around with the camera, well, I'll do that. I'll just show you around. It is an incredible mess. There's a tiger. Let's see if I can find a dog for you. Can you see her over there? That's her tail. And that's from the Dalai Lama. And it's just an absolute mess. But I love it, and I act on behalf of it. So if anyone tries to clean it up, I'm protecting it. You know, so what do we do with that? Well, the idea is that the space has an agency. We can act on behalf of it. And so we identify with it, and we get a sense of belonging with it. Let me make sure your perspective, it looks good. So, all right, so now let's take it one step further. So we have the immediacy around here. And now let's try to do this. This is a hard jump to make, but you have the space that you can feel around you. You can sense into it with your eyes. You can hear it. But now maybe you want to let your eyes go closed for this, but let's try to get the sensation of all of us right now talking about self-belonging and identity, and see if you can feel what it feels like to be joining together a conversation. Con is with, and verse is to turn, a turning with each other right now, that we are extended across space, even across time for anyone's listening to a recording, and just see if you can feel into that, the S of self-experience, the subjective sensation. It could be just imaginal in your mind, in your body, you know. It could actually be a relational field, we don't know. But see if you can just feel it, wherever it is, however it's being created. And now imagine, as we come to realize that we have an identity lens that we can widen, imagine how that perspective of the group of us, all of us interested in self-identity, belonging, and addressing ways in which, when the self is constrained, as it happens in modern culture, that it's identified with only the individual. When the self is thought of as only an individual, let's name that as the solo, meaning it's alone, self. So yes, we have an inner self, but that's not what we mean by solo self. Solo self, we mean this source of identity and belonging is only with the body. And that in this solo self-experience, it is at the root, for example, of saying, I will only belong to people who look like me. I'll only belong to people who have beliefs like me, a kind of plural solo self. That you have to be like me, and look at the language of like. that if you are like me, I will like you. And that similarity I can use in any criteria. You have to have a body that looks like mine. Let's name it race, even though race doesn't exist, but it's the basis of racism, where we can say this body and bodies like it are better than that body and bodies that's like that body. And that creates divisions and categories of self versus other, as we'll see. So right now, as we're expanding to all of us together, imagine if the conversation that comes from that subjective sense of togetherness and the perspective from this conversation could say, well, what if we act on behalf of a self that is bigger than this narrowly constructed view? What would that mean? And now let's take it one step further, not just to those of us actively in this joining together right now, but let's expand to all of humanity, to all human beings. We've now, as you know, crossed the 8 billion mark. There are 8 billion human beings on this planet. Just breathe into that. Now you say, well, Dan, that's too many. 8 billion, that's too many. Right. So it's not about trying to get to each of the individuals. It's feeling the collective human family, and just feel into that. And imagine if the human mind constructed some of our biggest challenges, the pandemics, certainly of how we've dealt with the coronavirus that's created the disease COVID-19, how we've mishandled that in so many ways because of the individuality of certain cultures like the United States, the most individualistic culture in the world, or how we create social injustice with racism and violence that happens across these categories of division, and even climate disaster, which is the catastrophe in many ways of human beings considering their species better than other species and treating the earth like one big trash can. You know, so imagine now our human family could wake up to the modern cultural view of a solo self as what our identity is made of. And imagine instead that if you now widen that identity lens to include all living beings on Earth. And my wife always says, why are you stopping with Earth? They're probably in other places in the universe. But let's just stay with Earth for now. And that'll be enough for now. And we can go bigger later, but just feel our membership within this present moment of all living beings on Earth. And now just to, open this up, we've now gone across species and across space, but now let's try to go across time, see what this feels like, this sensation, perspective, and agency, to actually imagine the Big Bang about 13 billion years ago, and then the beginning of life on Earth as energy was flowing from that potentiality of the Big Bang into molecules that then assembled into life forms, and then ultimately single cell forms. And then we have the divisions of plants and fungi and animals. And then we emerged as vertebrates. And then all the ways these different species then got more complicated in our vertebrate history to become mammals 220 million years ago, and then to primates about 50 million years ago, and then to come looking somewhat like a human being about 5 million years ago, and then our species coming in around, some people say 200,000 years ago, that's all. And then we begin to represent things on cave paintings about 40 to 30,000 years ago. And then we have evidence that we could think across time when we were repairing people's broken arms about 15,000 years ago. And all of our ancestors from the Big Bang to now, in many ways, can you feel that? That this across time is who we are. And then though you have a body that only gets to live about 100 years, you're just bigger than this 100-year segment of the space-time block. All of the descendants who will thank us for identifying this mistaken identity as the solo self and the self being just the individual. So when you do this exercise, you start to feel, as I did when I wrote the Intraconnected book, much like I felt when I went with some system scientists from MIT, Peter Senge, Metzobol, and others. We went to the Colorado mountains on a retreat, spent 3 days alone. And then when we came out of the aloneness of it all, everyone was talking about how interconnected they were, how interwoven and interdependent, all these interwords, which were so beautiful. And then it came time for this body to speak. And I said, because I hadn't been speaking for 3 days, I said, I hear what you're saying. I feel the excitement and I resonate with it. And I can't say inter anything because I was the creek. I was the trees. I was the clouds. I was the body. I was the whole thing. And I couldn't find the English word to say. So I said the word intraconnected, and people kind of nodded. And then we went and got back to our place we were staying. And I got on my computer to take some notes about what that 3-day experience was like. And every time I typed intraconnected, that linguistic symbol, into the computer, it changed it to interconnected. And I thought there was something wrong with my computer. And I looked it up, and it turns out there was no word. There is no word for the connectedness within the whole. It's just the perspective from the part. And I thought, wow, who is going to act on behalf of the whole if we don't have a word for it? What are we going to do if we have such an embedded modern cultural view, not in indigenous teachings, not in contemplative teachings, but in modern culture? And so I started, thinking this needs to be a conversation. We have one human being to another human being at a time, so we have what Arthur Zients, the emeritus quantum physics professor and the former president of Mind and Life, what he calls pervasive leadership, how each human being can be empowered with the knowledge and skills to go forward in a way that produces change and inspires other people. So every human being can be participating in this conversation. And when you think about the main challenges we have, and I was meeting with my wonderful mentor and friend, Joanna Macy, who is now 93, the age of my mom. And Joanna was saying that many people she knows who are activists are getting really exhausted. And we were talking about how hard the world has become, how difficult it is. She was just revising her book, Act of Hope, which is a beautiful book about how to really have the strength to face the challenges we need to work with. So I said to Joanna, which is what I'll say to you in closing and getting ready to open for discussion, Ellie, that when you trace the way the self develops across the lifespan, and we can get into more details in that in our discussion, you see that there are opportunities, lots of opportunities, windows of opportunities to allow the modern cultural lie of the self being separate, the solo self, to actually be opened up. You can do that as a parent with young children at home. You can do it in preschool with young kids in that age. You can do it across the educational system with primary school, with adolescents later on. You can do it in companies. You can do it in governments. So there's lots of opportunities. But when you have the courage to care and you're an activist, you say, oh, here are the things that go on. So often, Joanne and I were talking about this, so often people experience this understandably as threats of racism and social injustice, threats in the misinformation and the polarization, threats in loneliness, threats in the way people are addicted to digital objects, and threats to the climate catastrophe. When the body you're living in experiences something as a threat, you want to fight it, which is understandable as an activist, or you want to flee from it, or you want to freeze and tighten up your muscles, and those three are energizing and exhausting, or you get depleted and feel helpless and you faint, you collapse in a sense of hopeless despair. Any of those are exhausting if it lasts for long periods of time. So what I said to Joanna, which I'll share with you as a way of thinking about how do we go forward, is if we have enough knowledge about intraconnection, about looking at how we're not just a me, but we're also a we, and you can integrate those as me and we, and we like to say as we, that this is an opportunity to actually see the challenges that we face, not as threats, but literally as windows of opportunity that are kind of like dance partners, so that, you know, you wake up in the morning and instead of going, oh my God, I dread today because there are all these terrible things happening, fires and hurricanes and cyclones and droughts and famines, and oh my God, how am I going to do this? It's understandable. You could feel those are all threats to life itself. But we will burn out as people who care. So instead, you can actually shift your mind to saying, these things are actually happening, they're real. But instead of seeing them as threat, I have the empowerment to have a challenge mindset where, in a way, I look at these things as dance partners. And I ask myself the question, what's the dance going to be today? What's the music where I'm going to take on this challenge and say, let's do it. Let's dance together. Because if we move forward that way, we won't burn out, number one. We're going to find creative ways to actually, instead of polarizing and saying, these are the bad guys and we're the good guys, yay, let's go get the bad guys. Instead, we say, we're in this dance together. It's going to be a win-win situation. And around the world, you get a feeling like people are ready to wake up from this toxic view of the separate self that indigenous teachings have been telling us for thousands of years, and contemplative teaching has been telling us. And in our discussion, we can dive into it more about, okay, well, how can science really join these wisdom practices in a way that will be helpful, since modern culture hasn't listened? And my deepest hope in this little teeny conversation we're having now, or the book is basically a conversation, you know, primer, you know, how can you have this conversation in your own pervasive leadership, you know, that you take the journey of that book for yourself, your inner self, and you say, well, myself is not just in this body. I can start sensing into the larger human family, sensing into the family of all living beings. I can take the perspective of the whole human family and all living beings. And you know something? When I act with agency on behalf of this greater good, it's a win-win-win situation, because it is my expanded self. It is my we. And I'm also a me. I need to take care of myself and exercise the body, feed the body, sleep the body, enjoy the body. That's the me. So we're not getting rid of me. We're adding we in our identity. And in many ways, it's more like embracing the verb-like nature of unfolding, because when we nounify in separation, we do what the artist Rashid on the entry to the Brooklyn Public Library in New York says, having discovered the flimsy fantasy of certainty, I decided to wander. And in many ways, that flimsy fantasy of certainty is how we nounify and rigidify this separate self. We come to believe it's true, but then we get on a hedonic treadmill because it's actually a lie. But we try to live that lie, and we don't feel like there's a truth to it, but we don't know what the untruth is. So we keep on getting more and more stuff, and people are selling us stuff, and we want to get more stuff because then probably that'll help our hunger because we're not feeling satisfied, and on and on and on it goes. Producing stuff, consuming stuff, producing stuff, consuming stuff. And it's all without a sense of deep peace or clarity or truth. So part of this conversation is letting go of the flimsy fantasy of certainty. And you might say, well, this is a bummer. You know, I want some certainty in my life, but here's what I'll have you consider as I bring this to a close. The synonym for uncertainty is what? Well, the synonym for uncertainty, one way of seeing it, is freedom. It's freedom and possibility. And so that's what I hope our journey here together is, just the beginning of a conversation where we can release that freedom, release that possibility, when we let go of the noun-like solo self, which in many ways is a lethal lie, and open up instead to an intraconnected view that says, yes, you have an inner, yes, you have a relational inter, and the inner and the inter together are the intraconnected identity of we. So we thanks you, and I'm really honored to be here with you on this journey, and I look forward to connecting more with you in our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Always, when Dan and I were plotting up our plan for the evening and we were debating what to do when, and I asked him just, would you take us on a journey with you to start? Just a journey through who we perceive as Dan, what inner workings happen for this book so we can connect on that. So thank you. It's always a pleasure. And just, yeah, a warm invitation. I'm going to gently move us towards what typically is called Q&A, but what Dan wrote back to me and said, can it be community dialogue? And I thought, what a lovely way to reframe this part of our evening. So a warm welcome if you've been listening in. If you have any questions, to drop them in the Q&A box should be available to you, or you can put it into the chat and we'll start collecting just some collective consciousness. What is percolating? And I'm also going to invite, we have a few wonderful colleagues and students in the Zoom room with us, so we can actually see faces and hear voices. From my own heart, I don't want to take up too much airtime, but it's always so fun to get together with the Dan-like entity and the other entities that happen to collect when that happens, because I think for me, part of it, this idea of consiliency, of looking across different social cultural perspectives and bringing together different knowledge streams. It's one of my favorite parts about teaching in the BPMH program at U of T and at New College is we have this like collection of different types of wisdom and knowledge, and we're thinking like, how do they inform each other? And so to start off, I want to invite a colleague and peer at New College who's an associate professor in the teaching stream for the human biology program. We're in this college where I say, like, we have gender and equity studies and Buddhism, psychology, mental health, and human biology. What are we all doing in this corner of the university? There's a few more programs, but that's a few of them. And he teaches a course in complementary and integrative medicine, where mind, body, medicine, mindfulness is a big component of what students learn. And so as we're bringing in some different spas into the space today, I wanted to just invite Alistair, if you have something percolating on your mind, to maybe give us, as Michelle Chabon, who I'm going to invite after, said, some kindling for our discussion. Please jump in, comment, question, and then Dan, you can jump in, and then I'll introduce Michelle after that as well.
Thanks, Ellie. Hi, everyone. Dan, thanks for that great talk. It was very thought-provoking. I found myself sort of thinking and looking around the room and trying to process some of the things that you were saying, because I've never thought about things in that way before. So I guess, one, I actually Googled intraconnected and it came up, did you mean interconnected? So I didn't realize that wasn't a established word. So it was interesting to note that. But this whole concept of trying to establish intraconnectedness, from what I understood, is related to this sense of me, but being flexible with your sense of me, where if you've been told all your life, I'm Alistair, this is me, and I guess you get caught in this rigid way of thinking, is that, yeah, what else do you need to know? This is me. So I'm wondering, how do we sort of, if I'm understanding this correctly, is if we need to be flexible in our sense of me or we. I'm trying to put it all together. I'm thinking of examples of, for instance, my wife asked me to go somewhere to a gathering, and in my first thing I might say sometimes, or think to myself, well, I don't really want to go. I know the people that are going to be there, and I might, it's going to feel a certain way. And then sometimes I go and, I sort of allow myself to get to know people, and I find, new perspectives. Am I learning a different me? Is that what's happening? And then I'm getting more sense of belonging, because now I'm being connected with different people that I didn't think I would connect with before. So how do we continue to foster this, let's be flexible in who me is? Is mindfulness related to that? Is that in there somewhere? So those are some of the things I was thinking about as you spoke.
Yeah, beautiful, Alistair. It's great to be here with you. And, in the first part of what you're saying, your relationship with your life partner, your wife, I think we come in couples work, in being a part of a couple, but also I'm a couples therapist, to people get kind of solidified into a noun like this is who I am in the couple, and my partner's this way, and and so we can actually get stuck. So part of letting go of the noun-like flimsy fantasy of certainty is to really drop into what in system science would be called emergence, or Buckminster Fuller might call it synergy. This idea that there is a flowing way where parts of a system interact to give rise to something greater than the parts themselves. So the first thing to say in a couple from what you're saying is that, yeah, there's a kind of fluidity. We say, well, yeah, this is not what Alistair does. Well, maybe it is what Alistair does, whatever Alistair is. And when you embrace the verb-like facet of self-experience, it gives you freedom when you give up that drive for certainty. So that's one thing. The next thing you're asking about is like going into a social setting, wow, you realize you could actually start resonating with people in a way that you maybe thought it wouldn't happen, and it has a wider sense of belonging. Absolutely. So we narrow ourselves down in ways, sometimes just for self-preservation, because we can't be connected so much. But when you open up that way, I just came off of a trip to the Grand Canyon. I knew 3 people of 24 that went. So I met, 20, well, and I'm an extra one. So I met 20 new people. And by the end of, our 2 weeks together, it was like a whole sense of belonging. And now we're on some, way of chatting with each other. And it's absolutely hilarious. And the humor, I've never been with so many people who love to laugh so much. And in the little app thing we're on, we're laughing and making jokes. And before I did the trip, I didn't know 20 of those 23 other people. And it's been an absolute joy, even though it's not, I tend to be kind of very private and quiet and whatever. It was just absolutely beautiful to expand that way. And then the thing you're asking about the wording, and this is the trouble with words, is that they even by themselves, they can lock us in. So, if we put an ing on every word, and you're Alistairing, right now you're Alistairing and I'm Danning or whatever, so that's one way to start using the words. But in terms of literally the me and the we business, the term we is so interesting because it doesn't require at all that you worry about those distinctions. You can say there's a body speaking, that's the me. There's a relationality that is with my wife, with my friends, with the larger group, with all of the universe. Let's just put that on the broad thing of we. And then you just use the term we. And I have this we council that I'm in where we meet very regularly. And they were part of the pre-book book club. And I said to these people, can we have a discussion about a book that isn't written yet, but what would you want to feel like having read a book with, and I had like 9 chapters that spelled the word sibling, self, identity, belonging, love, intraconnected, noesis, and gnosis. I guess that's 7 words, seven chapters. And noesis is like conceptual knowing. Gnosis, Gnosis, is experiential knowing. Those are Greek terms. So what was really fun about doing this pre-book book club was that people could start almost to expand the self by looking at these 7 concepts. Now, the book went through a lot of iterations. I've been writing it literally for about 5 years. And so in the earlier iterations, it was, that it was organized around this acronym. And then that's how the pre-book club was. The pandemic hit. This group started meeting not every month, but every week. And we became like a family, and the people from very diverse backgrounds, and and it has become a family, and it really shaped me. But the we word in that family is what we say. Whenever we see an M or a W, we add the other letter, and then you make a funny word like, let's get together this weekend, or, oh, that was really wonderful, or something like that. But just like that, you are laughing your head off, and you're trying to dissolve the illusion of a separate self just by the M and W for English. So this we council for me, but for this body, has really changed the way I would answer the questions you're asking, Alistair, and say, the we term brings a kind of fullness to it all. You are it all. Do you have a body? Yeah. And that's what we would reserve the word me for. So if you really want to say, hey, I need to sleep, or this body, me, needs sleep, great. Maybe someone else doesn't need it. My wife doesn't need as much sleep as this body does. I've got to recognize that, I'm sleeping like 8.5, 9 hours. She gets up after 7 hours. It's once we realize that, then we could coordinate how it all worked. So each body was getting what the body needed. We have different bodies. So it's like, there's a process we haven't named, but called integration, where you honor differences and promote linkages. And that's where the me and the we are integrated. They're not blended, right? And that's one way to think about it.
Great, thanks, Dan. Really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Yeah, and maybe we can just continue on this this fun exploration. I want to invite in the voice of Michelle Shaban, founder of the Applied Mindfulness and Meditation Certificate Program at U of T. Has had so many different accolades and places that she has planted seeds for community building, of growth, of mindfulness. I was trying to think of the sentence I would say, and I was like, maybe she's like the mentor and fairy godmother to many of the mindfulness things that exist in the GTA and beyond. But with that, I just want to invite in Michelle's voice, comments, questions to add to this conversation we're having about me and we.
Unmute Michelle.
Hi, everybody. I said thank you to Ellie and Alistair and Dan. And thank you. I do feel I'm the fairy godmother of a lot, which is a very beautiful approach to life. So Dan, everybody knows, I think that's a part of us, that I followed Dan's work for a very long time. And that his work was the foundations of what us at U of T, so a me to we in a big way, were allowed to do, because I could hold up all of his books and say, Dan Siegel says this. And so he was a founding father as well, or maybe the fairy godfather of us all. And I thank him very much for that. And there were others. So Dan, I want to talk to you about agency. And even though it's about me to we, I want to talk about agency. So agency, I think, is one of the most important bestowals that we can give to other people in the world of me to we. Rather than asking people to be like me, we ask them to be them and then see where the connective tissue is. I think it's a relational science. And one of the things that I loved about this book, well, first of all, it's a continuation of the theory that you have been building over your lifetime. But one of the things that I liked, and it might be too difficult for people, but I loved your naming of the pandemics. And how those pandemics are sort of the epistemology of the individual, that we've had these weights put on us around these influencers. So if we could just sort of take a meditative stance for a minute, eyes open, and if you could just review what those pandemics are so that we can feel the context that is beyond our skin, maybe within our skin, and then to speak what you've already spoken about, but speak to it a little bit more in terms of, we have a choice, we have a potential, and we spend so much time looking at the potential of the pandemics rather than the potential within us, and that we can make that shift towards agency if we choose. So is that too much to talk about in about 5 minutes?
No. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Michelle. And I would, build on what Ellie said, but I might call you the Mwentor, M-W-E-N-T-O-R.
Funny.
So the me to we, and maybe we've all experienced this in our own way, but we're at a really, really pivotal point on the planet. And some of us may be a little bit older chronologically than others. For this body, when I was a little kid, there was certain biodiversity around. When I was a young kid going to the tide pools, I went there the other day, they were empty. And the calculations are that over 2/3 of the species that existed 50 years ago when I was a child and an adolescent, they're gone. over 66% gone. You know, our daughter is getting her doctoral degree in environmental science here at UCLA, and you know, she's spending her whole life, devoting her life to like course correcting that human outcome, you know, and doing something about it. And so we can feel that. I mean, and the underlying idea is that integration is health. And when human beings have created a self that is excessively differentiated from nature, you know, integration is differentiation plus linkage. When we're excessively differentiated and it's not balanced with linkage, the outcome is chaos and rigidity instead of harmony. It's kind of that simple. So, you know, when you look at this issue, and, you know, I work at the Garrison Institute in New York, and we have a program called Pathways to Planetary Health, where we're kind of working with this, and I'm an advisor to a group in Sweden, and you can look up what we do there. It's called Inner Development Goals, and it's trying to support working with the mind to help the United Nations get the Sustainability Development Goals happening. And as you know, as the COP gathering, this climate gathering that just happened, you know, not much came of it. I mean, there's going to be some support from the developed nations for the underdeveloped nations, and that was great. But other than that, things are very serious. So the first pandemic is the pandemic of climate disaster, you know, and so we don't like to think about it. I mean, Joanna Macy's been working on this for 50 years. And, you know, when she and I chat about it, the hope, I think, that maybe she and others had 30 years ago, that maybe we would wake up and turn it around, or that Al Gore tried to tell us about, you know, the inconvenient truth, and that was now 22 years ago. You know, human beings are not really taking it seriously. So we have about 10 years. So you're saying this is a serious thing, and it's hard to talk about. It is hard to talk about. Now, when the human mind gets threatened, it intensifies a primate vulnerability that we've had for 50 million years, which is to in-group, out-group distinctions. So we're seeing increased racism of all sorts, increased violence on a racial basis, whether it's anti-Semitism or anti-marginalized people. So social injustice is intensifying as scarcity is increasing and threat is increasing. And this is the vulnerability of us as a bunch of sophisticated primates with in-group, out-group distinctions, you know. So that's the second pandemic. I mean, these are not in any order, but I'm just listing them because you mentioned the numbers. You know, so we have racism and social injustice. Also, when we have self versus other as a concept underneath the categories of, yeah, there's me and my group, and there's you and that group, you know, that's a serious problem. So what do? Well, you can give up and say humanity is not going to be able to pull it off. Well, the feeling I had in these last 5 years of writing this book was, I actually think humanity can pull it off. But it's kind of like if someone comes to you limping and they have some kind of problem in their foot and they limp along, well, you say, stop for a second. Let's take your shoe off. Let's take your sock off. Let's look at your soul and see what's going on. Oh my gosh, you have a splinter. Let's remove the splinter. Let's heal the wound. Let's then go forward and walk in a balanced kind of way, you know? So in a way, the solo self is the splinter of the soul of the modern psyche. And we need to stop and say, hold on a second. Let's stop all the running and the walking. Let's remove the splinter. So of course, this is contemplative teachings. This is nothing new, I'm saying. And indigenous teachings taught this for thousands of years, also independently, nothing new. So when I was writing the book, I'm going, this is like not new. This is nothing new, I'm saying. And I say that in the beginning of the book. I say, this is not new, but no one seems to be listening. So if there's anything I can contribute, it's number one, let's look at integration as health. That's a new way of thinking about it. Let's look at how excessive differentiation is the scientific view of why the solo self is actually toxic and a lethal lie. Let's look at the pandemics, you know, which we name. And it's not just those two pandemics, but it's also the pandemic of loneliness. You know, the solo self is a pandemic itself. The addiction to screens, the polarization and misinformation, I don't know how it is where you are in Canada, the United States, it is nutso. I mean, you know, we need to find a way to have a we in this ununited States of America, because you see how no matter what information is being given, people believe what they believe. So, you know, that comes from this in-group, out-group stuff. So that's a part of it too. And then of course, there's the, you know, way we've handled the viral pandemic, you know, or mishandled it. And, or even just the reason we probably even have it in the first place is we've violated nature and not honored wild places, you know? So I don't want to leave this as a downer, but the feeling is, and Joanna Macy talks about this beautifully, if we don't go through the process of grief to see things as they are and the losses we've had, with Glenn Albrecht, a philosopher from Australia, calls, you know, earth emotions, and he has one in particular called solastalgia, which is a longing for a living world that used to be, that is no longer. Who wants to think about that and think about how they're gonna have a fun day? You know, you want to not think about that, right? So I wake up and literally I'll wake up and I'll go, it isn't really like this, is it? You know, am I having like a childhood dream? Am I still a kid and I'm dreaming about a world that might be this way? No, we're in a period where, and you know, my work in Sweden, you know, unfortunately, you know, we deal with the reality of this all the time. We're at Garrison. We have about 10 years. Less, really. We have about 8 years. We have about this decade. If we don't get our acts together as a humanity, it's not going to be good. And it's not going to be reversible. So people talk about mitigation, you know, reducing the harm. So of course, no one wants to think about what I'm talking about. And Michelle, thanks for asking the question. I start the book with it thinking this is not going to be no bestseller because nobody wants to read this stuff. They're going to read this stuff and go, oh, I don't want to read this. And that I didn't write it to try to be popular. I wrote it because, you know, as a person who cares, but also as a clinician, I thought, let's get this splinter out of the sole of the foot of humanity. Let's do it. And let's do it together. And the thing about it is, and this is what I hope the experience is, you know, not many people have read it. And I hope if you do read it, we can have another meeting, but you have read it, Michelle, but you know, but the thing about it is when I did the audio reading for the book, the audio engineer started like becoming unable to do his engineering. And I had to stop. I had to go into his booth. I said, what's going on? He goes, I'm just listening to your words and something in me is shifting. Something is being shifting. I said, okay, let me tell you what the whole book is about so you can understand how it goes, but we need somebody to do the engineering here. So that was my hope, was that the book is not just a bunch of science facts building on beautiful indigenous teachings and contemplative teachings, you know, like I quote Thich Nhat Hanh in the book, and really, I really want to make it clear, this is not some white colonialist guy, science trained, saying, here's something new. Quite the opposite. I say, this is old news, but we're just not listening to it. And maybe there's a new kind of imperative about it, but let's listen to our elders. And there's a documentary by from some Dutch filmmakers, and they gave me permission, fortunately, to use the quotes from these elders. Some of them are from Canada, you know, where they just say, look, now's the time to come back to our senses and to come back to our identity as this fuller thing. So you'll see their quotes in the very beginning of the book. And, you know, it's just an homage to indigenous wisdom. It's paying deep respect to contemplative wisdom. And then it says, look, here's how science can perhaps add something to the conversation so that together we don't have to divide, we can actually come together, and it's doable. I think we can do it. I think the bigger question is, will we?
Thank you for that. And a question coming in from one of our participants that I think just continues to build on each of these questions of what we're listening to, that I'll read aloud, and I really appreciate it. How can we work with we when we feel tensions or conflicts between the perceived separate parts? How can we shift out of that threat reaction when we feel frightened, hurt, or angered by what an other is doing to us? how does the we work when that temptation to polarize arises? And maybe from my
Yeah.
own voice, I read this question, I sort of thought like, yeah, Dan, this sounds great, but like how?
Yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, I'll give you a couple of ways of responding. I think it's a really important question, and let me try with just one example. Elijah Cummings was a congressman from Baltimore, who was an African American man who, was a leading figure in Congress. And in Baltimore, we have some of the highest homicide rates in our country, for sure, probably in the world. So Elijah asked me to come to Baltimore and do some work with him with the tensions across the races, blacks and whites coming together who had never come together before. And when they came into the room, the tension was so thick, you could just feel it. It was just so like that. So I did a practice that you're all familiar with called the Wheel of Awareness, where, you differentiate the knowing on the rim of this metaphoric, wheel, and then you take this singular spoke of attention after you're differentiating the different elements of the rim, and you bend it around into pure awareness in the hub. And that's it. And people, these are not meditators, believe me. These none of them had ever meditated before. So they come out of the practice and they start seeing each other as each other. Or as, when I did this in a parliament in another country, one of the parliamentarians said to me at the break, he goes, I didn't want to share with everyone during the break. During the sharing time, I said, yeah, I noticed that. He goes, you want to know why? I said, yeah, I want to know why. He goes, do you know the part when you bend the spoke around into the hub? I go, yeah, I'm familiar with that part. He goes, now he gets really slow and tears are forming in his eyes. He goes, I have never felt so connected to everyone and everything. I've never felt so much love before in my life. Now he's crying. And there's this silence. And then after a little while, I said to him, can I ask you a question? He goes, yeah. I said, you didn't want to share that with your colleagues? He goes, oh, no. He goes, if I said love, they'd think I was weak. So there's this other period of silence. We're staring at each other. And I said, can I ask you another question? He goes, sure. I said, so when you're making national law, when you're making federal policies, are you leaving love out of the reasoning? And his eyes got really, really big. And then he ran over his colleagues. I don't know what he said, but you can only hope that if there's a modern view, like it's very masculine, ridiculous view, love is weakness. Imagine, you don't have to imagine, that's the world we've created. So, with Elijah, what he said, Elijah Cummings, he said, this is amazing. I mean, how does that happen? I said, you drop people into that hub of that wheel, just like for the parliamentarian, this has happened now over and over and over again. People drop out of that experience of separateness. So what I do, if I'm having, a family member that I have difficulty with, who's, blasting me with some irrational, what in my view is irrational comments about this or that, because I do the Wheel of Awareness every day, I drop into my hub and I said, dude, I say to myself, my inner self, I said, don't react from your rim. Come to her from the COAL, connection, open awareness, and love. That's another way of using the COAL acronym. Come from the COAL state of the hub. You do it every day. You do it now, or this is not going to be a nice thing. And so I just look at her, and I mean, I'll tell you a really wild story, and this is the ultimate story. And if it didn't happen in front of a bunch of people, and it didn't really, I'd say this is impossible. But well, I don't know if I should. Yeah, I'll tell this story. No, I won't bother. Let me just say, I'm just debating whether to tell this because it's really, really painful story. Let me just I'll give you the generic of it. When a terrible thing was happening to somebody, he was being murdered. He looked at his murderer, and somehow the next thing he do is he's being stabbed in the neck, and he next thing you know, he's in a hospital, and the murderer is now in jail and asked to see him. And his sons had sent him, they read the book Brainstorm, and his son sent him to this workshop I was doing in California. And we did the Wheel of Awareness. He got in the hub. He goes, oh my God, that's the feeling I had when I was being murdered. That's the feeling I was having when being murdered. And now people thought I was crazy because I got really peaceful and really filled with love. And then when I went to see the murderer, who was now on death row, of course, because he had killed somebody else, he said to me, I just have to speak to you. And he goes, what? And the murderer says to him, I killed your friend, and now I was literally killing you. But you looked at me with so much love. Your eyes were so filled with love, I couldn't kill you. And then the guy says in front of all these people, now I understand I'm not crazy. I got in touch with the generator of diversity, you know, this plane of possibility, the hub of the wheel. We have a whole thing. And he goes, and now I understand why my son sent me to see you, because now I understand I went to that hub, not because I'm a meditator, but just because fortunately it's in all of us and it saved my life. So all I can say to you is we all have that capacity. So when you're asking the question about, well, you know, there's fighting, you know, if that guy, when he's being murdered by the other, can come from that place, anyone can do it, you know, and so I do believe that the fabric of the universe is that COAL, it's connection, it's open awareness, and it's love. And, you know, love is what links us. It's this natural portal through which integration arises. So we have to let people get out of these noun-like fixations on a separate self and access, it's an experiential knowing, you know, and he just got it, fortunately, because that's why he's still alive. I hope that wasn't too intense a story to tell you, but it's a true story. And if you told me that story, I said, oh, come on. But I was actually there surrounded by a lot of people hearing this story going, oh my God. Does that address the question, Ellie?
Well, I think it's a beautiful invitation. You know, I want to share a few things because we're coming towards the end of our session, but what it was reminding me of is just, you know, thank you. There's so much collective wisdom in this room, and to hear for me what at the heart of it, as we said, we don't want to leave ourselves despondent, but a note that just came into our Q&A was just thanks for a lovely, deep, and meaningful session. Thank you so much for organizing this, and Dan for bringing this essential material forward at this crucial moment in history. And it just makes me think, you know, we have this, as Dan said, even though maybe I'm Ellie sitting in my chair at my desk, that I got to touch that moment that I am also in a space with a whole bunch of other humans who are interested in this and who are taking this moment at this critical moment in history. And so, you know, each story, each anecdote, each question that's here, I think is part of this greater dialogue. And I think, you know, as humans, we're nearing the end of the semester at university, and some of us are going, oh, it's ending, I'm glad, or it's not, or we won't see each other again. There's all these things coming up. And I'm just reminded of Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings, you know, from the lens I bring of Buddhism, but also from other spaces of no beginning, no end. You know, our session may end here in some ways, but it doesn't. And, you know, maybe this question also coming up that we may not have time to get to the whole answer. Dan, I'll have you bring it in for some closing remarks, but how can we affect change on a quick enough timeline, on a large enough scale to negate the destructive effects of capitalism on the self? And, you know, I'll pass it back to you in a moment, but just to say, this warm invitation, often if I'm moderating events like this, you know, I have some sense of loss as we depart, or, oh, do we have 10 more minutes? Or I don't know if anyone gets that end of meeting panic. We all like cause some harm to ourselves, and either right at the end of meetings, we try and do too much and it's kind of chaotic and my nervous system goes up even though the rest of the meeting was okay. Then my default mode network is activated for like the rest of the day. And I've been trying to think like, what do we do with our last few minutes that leaves my nervous system calm? So I will turn it back to you, but, you know, not to overly plug it, but just to say again, this book, when I read a book of Dan's, it feels like he's here with me, like I'm hanging out with a good friend. And so if you've been inspired by the conversation today, I do really encourage you to consider, you know, picking this up. And it's a book that starts with some interesting things. There's a whole chapter called Welcome. And so just to say, there's a lot to keep exploring here, that we may not have the answers for the timeline and the scale to address what we have colonized ourselves with over time. But just to thank Dan also for calling in all this wisdom and for giving it a space to maybe be heard and seen again. I think that's really beautiful. And also I'll have drop into the chat our mailing list for the Buddhism Psychology and Mental Health program if you want to connect with us, as we're really interested in integrating different knowledge streams. So with that, I'll say this is not an end. Hopefully it's a beginning for those of you who have been part of our community. And I'll just take a moment also to thank our partners. We had the Mindfulness Project at Sick Kids, Mindfulness Hamilton, the Factor in Wintosh School of Social Work, and a Mindful Society Global Institute, as well as New College and the University of Toronto. And all of you here, we are part of a community of belonging, that we are interested and curious and wondering. And I think I heard that word hope, that there is hope here because this dialogue is happening. So those are some thank yous from my heart to all of yours, just really connecting together and having this space to share. And with that, maybe I'll turn it over to Dan for some closing remarks. And for those of you who want to hear about more events that we have coming up, and we are always looking into dialogues, the link is there. And also to say Intraconnected is a thing you can hold and say hi to after this. And also to check out the Mindsight Institute. Dan has amazing resources available online. But with that, I'll pass the mic back to you, Dan, for some closing remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Ellie, and thank you all for being here. And Ellie, thank you for reaching out and facilitating this whole community dialogue. You know, this question that's coming up, and I've heard this from one of my deepest teachers, which is both my son, Alex Siegel, and my daughter. Both of them have taught me this, and I think this must be a general source of wisdom, but it's the idea that we set a direction and we focus our intention in that direction, but we don't get obsessed about the destination. We don't worry about the outcome. So what I hope Intraconnected can do, and certainly literally on a practical level, you can have a book club. You can, you know, I have a MWE community I'm a part of, and I don't know if I'd be where I'm at if I didn't have that group of people where we check in very regularly, and we're, you know, but it's all in the setting of MWE, you know, and you can have a MWE group that you create. Now, what's the directionality the book is inviting us to do? It's inviting us with, you know, this pervasive leadership to realize in whatever small ways, it could be a little conversation you have with your inner self. It can be a conversation you have with your partner or life partner, with other members of your family. It could be a conversation with a neighbor. It could be a stance you take that starts to dissolve. And you're talking about capitalism. Capitalism is based on this solo self view, absolutely. And it's this hedonic treadmill of, you know, consuming goods that other people can, you know, manufacture. So everyone is getting more stuff, and we're stuffed with stuff. And it's a serious problem for the resources on Earth. It's a serious problem of distracting the beautiful collaborative creativity that we have as a humanity, that comes when we feel like, oh my God, I don't have enough stuff, or I don't have as much stuff as you have. So I'm not okay, I'm not good enough. All this stuff that gets us, you know, racing around with a feeling of dis-ease, literally, you know, so that what you can do in terms of this question is, number one, try reading the book seriously and just see how it sits with you and how it feels in you. And it's a book with experiential, not so much practices, but experiential journeys you go on that take you across a lifespan. So you'll reflect on your own me journey you've been on. But then there's an invitation to start expanding that to have also a we. And the we idea is, it's not about getting rid of the me. This is not saying me to we, it's about me to we, if you will. And it's not about saying there is no self. It's about saying, let's expand the self. So we take the old term self-transcendent emotions and we change them to self-expanding emotions of what? Awe, gratitude, and compassion. So those three emotions, there are ways of actually practicing compassion every day. There's a way of practicing gratitude every day. There's a way of practicing awe every day. Dacher Keltner has a beautiful book on awe coming out January 6th. So that'll be a book to think about. And I talk a lot about his work in Intraconnected. But the idea of awe, gratitude, and compassion are the emotional experiences that you can practice that start expanding yourself. And then as you begin to live like that, you could do the wheel of awareness if you like to do a meditative practice. Not everybody likes to do meditation, but if you do that, And then every day you'll see at the end of the practice, there's a whole mui thing that goes on there. And you start the day from this place of abundance. And that's how we have to dance with the challenges rather than freak out about the threats, you know, and this is the invitation, but it's not about doing it alone, right? This is about doing it together. So I'm really honored to be here as a mui. And I really believe, and I said this earlier, but it is very possible that we can turn this around, because what we're talking about is cultural evolution. And cultural evolution can happen really, really quickly. So the question isn't, can it? I think it can. The question is, will it? And that we can't answer. We can get ourselves prepared. And as Louis Pasteur says, chance favors a prepared mind. Let's prepare our minds. Let's understand what the splinter is. And we got to have fun when we're doing it, because if it's all downbeat and oppressive and we're locking on to, oh my God, look what we've lost. Oh my God, what can happen? It's not going to be productive. So ironically and beautifully, to be productive, we also have to be collaborative, and we need to have lots of fun doing it, right? So we need to just enjoy it as we go, because even if it doesn't work out, as one person said to me recently, a wise person, she said, you know, it may not work out this time. And I said, this time? And I realized, yeah, this is about, you know, all sorts of descendants. We don't know who our descendants are going to be, but we can be devoted to whatever it's going to be for them. And we can't worry about it. We can just aim our direction that way. And at first it was shocking, you know, and then I realized she was absolutely right, you know, and it's that statement from Alex and Maddie, you get devoted to a pathway and don't worry about the outcome, you know, and that's what we can do. Whatever we're doing in our lives, just let your heart and let your gut and let your head work together to drive us toward. And the book is just suggesting the way to do it is to dissolve the illusion of a separate self, realize we are me and a we, and we is the interconnected identity and this broader belonging. That is what the self really can live into. So together we can make it happen, and that's going to be a world that's kinder, more compassionate, more filled with love. I think it's absolutely possible, and we can do it. Thank you.
Thank you for those words of hope, of action, that we are not alone in this work, that is part of the wisdom of this. I think dissolving the separate self not only has this potential for connection, but also to relieve us that we are not in this work alone. And so also to rely on my mui, I will perhaps close the session by just reading the last comment that came into our Q&A. Kelly, I don't know who you are, but the entity of Kelly, mui with us, you are closing the session with just the words, "Thank you so much for an evening of inspiration and encouragement." I don't have to find those words myself. They just come in. So with that, we will gently proceed in our days. And I hope that however the entity of you is, that you are also connected to mui, that this is an open and ongoing dialogue. At our program at U of T, we're happy to keep chatting. I know Dan is happy to keep chatting through Mindsight, through this book. And so just wishing everyone well in whatever ways wellness might be showing up for you, big or small, to notice your conditions for happiness. And Dan, anything else you'd like to say before we close the webinar and continue on in this world?
No, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.